There is a moment when the world doesn't break, doesn't explode, doesn't make a sound, and yet it ceases to be the same. It doesn't happen outside, it happens inside. You continue breathing, walking, answering messages, completing tasks. Everything seems intact, but something essential has silently shifted. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of true inner confrontation, when consciousness begins to expand beyond the comfort of the known. It's not a glorious awakening, it's a profound estrangement, a gaze that no longer fits into the scene. You may have spent years searching for meaning. You read books, listened to masters, reflected on your history, questioned your impulses, tried to understand your wounds, all with the promise of feeling more alive, more whole, more awake. However, what emerges now is neither enthusiasm nor ecstasy. A disconcerting stillness arises. Conversations seem predictable, relationships repetitive, emotions almost mechanical. The world keeps functioning, but you feel as if you are a few steps behind, observing. Perhaps you're not sad, perhaps you're not anxious, and that makes everything even more confusing. What sets in is a subtle detachment, a feeling of being present without truly participating. Jung warned that when consciousness expands, the individual begins to perceive the patterns behind what previously seemed spontaneous. You start to notice the roles, the scripts, the automatic reactions, and when that happens, something breaks. There's no way to pretend you didn't see it. It's like walking through the backstage area of a play in the middle of a performance. Suddenly, you see the ropes, the gears, the fake sets supporting the spectacle. And from that moment on, the drama no longer convinces in the same way. You can still watch, but you can no longer lose yourself in the illusion. Then comes a weariness that isn't physical. It's the weariness of someone who sees too much. At this point, an unsettling question begins to echo. What's wrong with me? You observe people becoming indignant, competing, fervently defending identities, and something within you simply can't keep up. Not out of arrogance, not out of coldness, but because something inside you no longer responds in the same way. Jung would call this the first real contact with the shadow, not as something dark in a moral sense, but as everything that has been ignored, repressed, or never questioned. And this is where the deepest fear arises. Alone in the silence of the night, you may wonder if you haven't gone too far. If, in seeking understanding, you haven't ended up distancing yourself from your own life. If you haven't analyzed your joy until it dissolved. The sensation is not one of sharp pain, but of heaviness, a constant tightness, as if something were suspended in your chest. Jung described this state as the tension between opposites. The old world has not yet completely died, but the new one has not yet been born. You begin to suspect you've lost something essential, that the sparkle is gone, that perhaps you were happier before questioning so much. But this suspicion carries a trap, because it stems from the idea that unconsciousness was fullness, and Jung was clear. That which is not conscious is not whole. The previous comfort was sustained by blind identification with inherited roles, expectations, and narratives. The pain now arises precisely because these structures are beginning to crumble. There's a peculiar loneliness at this stage. Even surrounded by people, you feel an invisible distance, as if you were speaking a language no one else hears, as if you woke up in a house where everyone is still sleeping. Jung said that this isolation isn't social, it's symbolic. It's the detachment of the ego from the persona, that social mask that allows us to function in the world, but which was never our true center. And perhaps the most provocative question is this: what if this emptiness isn't a flaw? What if this feeling of not belonging isn't a mistake, but a sign that something bigger has begun to move? Jung saw this discomfort as a calling, an unsettling, unromantic calling that arises when the psyche no longer accepts living only on the surface. The problem is that no one teaches us what to do when the mask starts to weigh us down. No one explains that this inner silence isn't an absence of life, but a withdrawal from the noise. And without references, the ego panics. It wants to return to what was familiar. It wants to reconnect with the old excitement, the old certainties. But something inside you knows that this is no longer possible. You're not at the end of anything, but you're also not at the comfortable beginning you imagined. You're on a threshold. And Jung warned, those who reach this point must learn to endure the tension without running away. Because what still seems empty silently holds the seed of a transformation that cannot be rushed. The question that remains is not, how do I go back to being who I was, but something far more unsettling. If that which sustained my identity is falling apart, what is trying to be born in its place? At some point in this silent journey, you begin to perceive something even more disturbing than the detachment from the outside world. You can no longer maintain the image you had of yourself. It's not just work, relationships, or habits that have lost their luster. It's your entire identity that begins to falter. What you used to call I no longer seems so solid. Jung stated that this is the moment when the ego begins to lose its monopoly on the psyche. And this loss is not merely symbolic. It is felt in the body, in the emotions, in the way you position yourself in life. You can notice this in simple situations. Someone praises you for something that once defined who you were, and the praise finds no support. Criticism that once destabilized you now sounds distant, not because you've become indifferent, but because something essential has shifted. Jung said that when the ego ceases to be the center, it begins to orbit something larger, still unknown. And it is in this displacement that the feeling of being without ground arises, as if the internal axis had been removed. Perhaps you try to explain it to yourself. Tell yourself that you're just going through a strange phase, that everything will soon return to normal. But deep down, you know it's not a passing phase. There's a silent intuition that something irreversible has been triggered, and that generates fear, because the ego thrives on predictability. But let me ask you, if what you once were can no longer sustain you, why insist on keeping it alive? There is a curious detail in this stage that Jung observed attentively. The psyche begins to produce symbols spontaneously, more intense dreams, recurring images, sensations difficult to translate into words. You might dream of old houses, corridors, locked doors, mirrors, unfamiliar figures, or wake up with the feeling of having visited a strange and familiar place at the same time. This is not random. For Jung, when the ego loses control, the unconscious takes on the task of reorganizing the whole. And this is where something unexpected happens. You begin to realize that you're not only distancing yourself from the outside world, but also from the internal narratives you used to repeat. Stories about who you should be, about what success is, about what a well-lived life is. These narratives begin to sound artificial, inherited, almost imposed. You realize that you've lived for a long time within ideas that you never examined deeply, and now, examining them becomes inevitable. This realization can be disconcerting, because if these stories are no longer valid, what guides your choices now? Jung said that, at this point, the individual begins to experience a creative void, an inner space where old certainties have died but new ones have not yet been born, and the ego, unable to tolerate this space, tries to fill it quickly with new labels, new beliefs, new spiritual identities. But what if this urge to fill a void is precisely what needs to be put on hold? There's a subtle shift that happens when you start to notice that you don't need to immediately answer the questions that arise. You begin to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, of not having a clear definition of who you are or where you're going. Jung saw this capacity as essential for individuation. He stated that the psyche matures when the individual learns to live with paradoxes without trying to resolve them prematurely. At this stage, you may even feel strange about yourself. There are days when everything seems clear, almost light, and others when the confusion returns with force. You may wonder if you are moving forward or regressing, if you are becoming more aware or just more distant. But this oscillation is part of the process. Jung said that the path is not linear. It moves in spirals, returning to the same themes under new perspectives. And then an even deeper, almost forbidden question arises. What if I was never who I thought I was? This question doesn't come loaded with despair, but with bewilderment, as if you were looking at an old building and realizing for the first time that it was built on foundations that weren't yours. If the ego was a necessary but temporary construct, what begins to emerge when it dissolves? There is something profoundly lonely about this point, because this investigation cannot be outsourced. No one can do it for you. Advice sounds generic. Ready-made answers seem shallow. Jung warned that the true encounter with the self requires a temporary distancing from external references, not to reject them, but to avoid relying on them while the internal structure reorganizes itself. You may feel a kind of grief without an object, a diffuse sadness without a clear cause. It's not longing for someone specific, but for a version of yourself that no longer exists. Jung recognized this grief as legitimate. After all, something has died. Not a person, but a way of being in the world. Ignoring this grief delays the process. Healing is not weakness, it's integration. And perhaps this is where the suspense intensifies, because the more you let go of old definitions, the more evident it becomes that something new is approaching. It doesn't yet have form, name, or language, but it manifests as an internal pressure, a silent calling. Jung said that the self announces itself first as absence, then as restlessness, and only later as direction. Can you sustain this calling without trying to dominate it? What is beginning to emerge is that the crisis is not a collapse, but a profound reorganization. It is not the end of identity, but the beginning of a less rigid identity, less dependent on approval and control. But before this consolidates, you need to traverse territory where the ego has no answers, and the unconscious has not yet explained itself. And perhaps the most unsettling question at this stage is this: if you can no longer rely on what was, and you still don't know what will be, are you willing to remain whole in this interval, without running away, without getting distracted, without diminishing yourself? There's a point in this journey where something changes in quality. It's no longer just confusion, nor just emptiness. It's as if life itself begins to respond in a strange, almost complicit way to what's happening inside you. Jung observed that when the ego weakens and the self begins to draw closer, improbable coincidences arise, unexpected encounters, disturbing or revealing dreams. He called this synchronicity, not as magic, but as the alignment between internal states and external events. You can notice it in small details. A book falling off the shelf onto a page that seems to speak directly to you. A casual conversation where someone unknowingly says the phrase that's been echoing in your mind for days. A dream so vivid it stays with you all morning, as if it's left a trail. None of this is spectacular to an outsider, but for those who experience it, it carries a symbolic weight that's hard to ignore. At the same time, things that once seemed solid begin to effortlessly unravel. Relationships you maintained out of habit naturally drift apart. Invitations stop arriving. People with whom you shared long conversations no longer seem to speak the same language. Jung said that when the psyche shifts its center, the surrounding environment reorganizes itself, not as punishment, but out of coherence. That which no longer resonates simply loses its power. There are curious accounts from Jung's patients who, during this stage, developed an unexpected sensitivity to time. Days seemed too long. Hours passed quickly or slowly without explanation. The notion of linear progress began to fail. You may feel something similar, as if the external clock continues to tick, but the internal one is at a different pace. This happens because the ego, responsible for organizing experience chronologically, no longer governs alone, and then improbable events arise within you. Old emotions return, but without the same intensity. Fears that once paralyzed you now appear almost like distant echoes. You may remember episodes from your childhood with a new clarity, not to suffer again, but to understand. Jung saw this as the integration of the shadow. It's not about reliving the past, but about reinterpreting it from a broader point of consciousness. At that moment, something surprising happens. You begin to realize that the initial emptiness wasn't absence, but space. A space where new internal connections are formed. Thoughts that previously didn't interact now converse. Contradictions begin to coexist without generating so much conflict. You become capable of sustaining opposing ideas without needing to immediately choose a side. For Jung, this capacity was a clear sign of psychic maturity. There is also a subtle shift in how you relate to control. Before, there was a constant need to predict, plan, and ensure. Now, even with insecurity, you begin to let go a little. Not out of giving up, but because you realize that the attempt at excessive control was a form of fear. Jung stated that the self does not reveal itself to those who try to dominate it, but to those who learn to listen to it. Some would call it faith, others intuition. Jung preferred to call it a dialogue with the unconscious. You begin to trust more in inner impressions, in bodily signals, in a kind of silent guidance. It's not a clear voice, nor an order. It's more like an inclination, a sense of direction that manifests itself gradually. And curiously, when you follow this inclination, even without fully understanding it, something falls into place. It is common, at this stage, for external events to seem less threatening. Problems still exist, bills need to be paid, conflicts arise. But the internal reaction changes. There is less dramatization, less identification. Jung observed that when the psychic center shifts from the ego to the self, circumstances cease to be interpreted as personal attacks. They begin to be seen as movements of life, not as judgments. You might be surprised to find that situations that once made you anxious are now faced with a strange calm. Not because you've become indifferent, but because something within you has stopped depending so much on external outcomes. This is a curious aspect of the process. The less the ego tries to assert itself, the more stable the person becomes. But this stability is neither definitive nor comfortable all the time. There are relapses. There are days when the old fear returns, when doubt prevails. Jung never romanticized this path. He knew that the individuation process requires repeated descents. Each descent, however, happens from a broader level of consciousness. You don't fall into the same place twice. And perhaps the most unlikely event is this. Amidst all of this, you begin to feel a strange gratitude. Not constant, not euphoric, but real. Gratitude for not having run away when everything became confusing. Gratitude for not having become completely numb. Gratitude for going through something that, although uncomfortable, feels real. Jung said that this feeling arises when the individual begins to realize that their life is not just a sequence of events, but a process with symbolic meaning. You begin to suspect that what seemed like a loss was, in fact, a strategic retreat, that the silence was preparation, that the withdrawal wasn't abandonment, but reorganization. And this suspicion changes everything, because if this is true, then you're not being pushed out of life, but pulled into a deeper center of it. Engagement returns, but in a different way, no longer driven by superficial excitement, but by genuine curiosity. You begin to want to understand what is emerging, to carefully observe the internal movements, to respect the timing of the process. And perhaps it is at this point that the question ceases to be, when will this end, and transforms into something more subtle. What exactly is trying to reveal itself now that the noise has subsided? At some point in this journey, the experience ceases to be merely introspective and begins to touch on something more radical. It's no longer just about understanding oneself, nor about observing internal patterns. It's as if an even deeper layer is reached, a layer where the question is no longer who am I, but what within me is experiencing this. Jung said that this is the moment when the individual begins to realize that they are not just a collection of thoughts, emotions, and memories, but a living process in constant transformation. This realization doesn't come smoothly. It's usually accompanied by an internal upheaval. You begin to notice that what you called self emerges and disappears throughout the day. One moment you're confident, the next, insecure. One moment enthusiastic, the next, tired. And suddenly, something forcefully asserts itself. If all this is constantly changing, what remains? Jung saw in this question the beginning of the true shift in the psychic center. This insight can be disconcerting because it threatens the ego's last stronghold, the feeling of continuity and control. You might feel a slight panic upon realizing that you're not as solid as you thought, that your identity isn't a fixed thing but a flux. And at that point, the natural impulse is to try to cling to something, a belief, an explanation, a new role. But the more you try to fix it, the more it slips away. There are curious accounts of people who, at this stage, experience a kind of silent collapse. Not an outburst, not a visible crisis, but an internal fall of old certainties. Values that seemed unquestionable begin to be relativized. Old fears lose some of their power. Ambitions that guided their decisions no longer convince. This generates tension because the ego needs clear narratives to orient itself. Jung stated that this collapse is not destruction, but the dissolution of what no longer serves. You might find yourself questioning past choices with a different perspective, not with intense guilt, but with a sense of unease. Why was this so important to me? This question isn't laden with judgment, but with clarity. And clarity, while liberating, is also frightening, because it reveals how much your life has been guided by conditioning you never consciously chose. At this point, something unexpected happens. Instead of feeling more lost, you begin to feel a strange expansion, as if the inner space were increasing. The problems still exist, but they seem smaller in relation to the whole. Jung said that when the individual begins to identify less with the ego, a broader perspective emerges, almost as if you were observing your own life from a higher point, not with superiority, but with functional detachment. But this expansion brings a new tension. If you no longer fully identify with your thoughts, emotions, or roles, what exactly is making decisions now? Who chooses? Who acts? This question is not merely philosophical. It becomes practical. You may find yourself paralyzed for a few moments before making simple decisions, not out of insecurity, but because you realize you no longer want to act automatically. Jung warned that this pause is natural when the ego ceases to be the sole commander. It is at this moment that many try to transform this experience into a new spiritual identity. They begin to define themselves as awakened, conscious, different, but this is merely the ego changing its clothes. Jung was emphatic in stating that the spiritualized ego is as limiting as the materialistic ego. Individuation does not create a better persona, it dissolves the need for personas. The tension increases when you realize there are no guarantees. There's no manual, no seal of completion. The process doesn't promise constant comfort. It demands continuous honesty. You begin to see that some pains persist, not because you failed, but because they are part of the human experience. And that can be frustrating. After all, wasn't the intention of consciousness expanding and resolving everything? Here's the twist that few expect. Jung said that integration doesn't eliminate suffering, but it changes its quality. Pain ceases to be experienced as personal punishment and begins to be understood as a movement of life. This doesn't make it pleasant, but it makes it bearable. And this change is profound, because you stop fighting against what you feel and begin to allow the experience to happen without so much resistance. This allowing is not passivity. It's a more sophisticated form of participation. You act when necessary, but you are not defined by the outcome. You get involved, but you don't lose yourself. Gradually, you realize that the internal tension diminishes precisely when you stop trying to get rid of it. Jung would call this a conscious approach to the self, not as something external, but as a reorganization of the internal axis. And then the final expectation arises. Because if all this is happening, if the ego no longer occupies the center and something broader begins to manifest, what comes next? Is there a resting point? A place where this search ends? Or does this process continue indefinitely? This question isn't answered immediately. It remains suspended, creating a state of intense attention. You feel you're very close to something essential, but you still can't name it. It's like standing before a door that no longer frightens you, but hasn't yet been opened. And the growing feeling is clear. The outcome won't be an external achievement nor a spectacular revelation, but a radical change in how you relate to everything that happens. And perhaps that's precisely what prepares the ground for what comes next. Because if the ego no longer needs to control, if identity no longer needs to defend itself all the time, then something can finally relax. Expectation transforms into attentive silence, and this silence announces that the next step will not require effort, but a conscious surrender to what has always been there, waiting to be recognized. There comes a point when you realize there's nothing left to achieve on this path. Not because everything is resolved, but because something essential has repositioned itself within you. The search loses momentum, the effort diminishes, and a silent understanding begins to settle in. Jung said that the individuation process doesn't culminate in perfection, but in wholeness. And wholeness doesn't mean the absence of conflict. It means the ability to sustain one's own life without abandoning oneself in the midst of it. Perhaps the greatest relief comes when you understand that you no longer need to define yourself all the time. You don't need to explain who you are, nor justify why you changed. You begin to live with more psychic energy. You choose your battles, conversations, and relationships better. You learn to say no without guilt, and to say yes without violating yourself. This is not coldness. It's emotional maturity. It's the ego finally recognizing that it doesn't need to control everything to exist. In practice, applying all of this begins simply. It begins with the language you use with yourself. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," you start saying, "I am aware of anxiety." Instead of "I am empty," "I perceive a feeling of emptiness." This change seems small, but it creates space. It separates you from the experience without denying it. Jung believed that this ability to observe without merging is one of the clearest signs of psychic integration. Another practical step is learning to respect your own signals. Emotional exhaustion, recurring irritation, and apathy in the face of certain situations are not character flaws. They are information. When you learn to listen to them, you begin to adjust your life from the inside out, and no longer to meet external expectations. This may mean reducing commitments, changing routines, and reassessing relationships. It's not always comfortable, but it's coherent. You also learn that not every emotion needs to be resolved. Some just need to be felt and experienced. Jung warned that trying to eliminate feelings considered negative only strengthens the shadow. Integration happens when you allow joy, fear, boredom, enthusiasm, and doubt to coexist without one needing to destroy the other. This gives life a more real, less idealized texture. Over time, something curious happens. Loneliness changes in quality. It ceases to be absence and becomes presence. You begin to tolerate silence without compulsively filling it. You can be with yourself without the feeling that something is missing. And it is precisely from this place that new connections emerge. Connections less based on neediness and more on real affinity. Less effort, more reciprocity. The path doesn't require isolation from the world. It requires discernment. You continue working, relating, participating in life. But now you do so from a more stable center. When something goes wrong, it hurts, but it doesn't destroy you. When something goes right, it brings joy, but it doesn't define who you are. That's the fundamental difference. You begin to experience events without being swallowed up by them. Perhaps the greatest transformation is realizing that there is no final state to be reached. There is no day when everything falls into place forever. What exists is a more honest relationship with the flow of life. Jung said that individuation is a continuous process, not a destination. And this paradoxically brings peace, because you stop chasing an idealized version of yourself and begin to inhabit the possible, present, living version. If you've made it this far, something along this journey has spoken directly to you. Perhaps it was a discomfort, an identification, a feeling of relief. Don't ignore it. Take it into your daily life. Observe yourself in the coming days. Notice when you act out of fear and when you act out of clarity. Notice where you still give up in order to be accepted and where you begin to choose. Small, repeated choices build a different life. And now, I'll make you a simple and direct invitation. If this content resonated with you, please like this video. This helps the channel reach other people who may be experiencing exactly this moment. If you feel like it, leave a comment. It can be anonymous. It can be a word, a phrase, something that represents what you are going through right now. Your experience can be the support someone needs to not give up on themselves. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe. Here, the commitment is to continue exploring this path with depth, honesty, and respect for everyone's pace. Nothing you've experienced so far has been in vain. The discomfort, the emptiness, the confusion weren't failures. They were signs that something more genuine has begun to move. You don't need to become someone different. You just need to stop distancing yourself from who you already are. And perhaps that's the greatest transformation possible. Living with less illusion, less fear, and more presence. The rest, life will take care of showing you, step by step, at the exact pace you can sustain.